and pleased to have the opportunity to talk about truth. And in some ways, that the starting point is to think and to tease out what we mean by truth. And as we know, particularly in societies transitioning from conflict, the construction of truth matters. It is integral to both the ending of conflict and moving forward in conflict. And when we think about the ways in which the language of truth has been used to frame the way we understand what has happened during a conflict and how we move forward from conflict, we discover deeply contested terrain. And we also discover deeply gendered terrain. And it is the gender nature of that terrain that I really want to talk about today. So if we think back historically, this discussion about truth in some ways for many of us crystallizes around the South African Truth and Reconciliation process. We had a very prominent TRC, headed by a very prominent man. There were a number of women commissioners on the TRC, and in some sense the notion of that Truth Commission captured the public and the international imagination as to what that entity and sort of capture of the word truth did to the South African process. Right? So I want us to bear both the positive, the potential, and the cynical in mind as we think about a gendered telling of truth in a post-conflict process. Now, if we think about the format of truth-telling, there's a wonderful book by a woman called Priscilla Hayner, who works for an organization called the International Center for Transitional Justice, who's mapped various kinds of truth commission, truth recovery processes. For many of us, truth processes are sort of tied up with the South African example, but in fact, South Africa is only one of a spectrum of options on the truth-telling table. And there have been historical models of inquiry, there have been models that have had a truth but not a reconciliation piece, there have been models that have sought to do much less than the South African models sought to do. There are models that have been very focused on particular violations, particular cases, narrow truths if you want, rather than thicker truths. And so I think when we think about what a gendered telling of truth might be, that we have to start to think in the widest possible way of the range of choices there might be on a menu of how you would institutionalize truth-telling. So, in thinking about what a gendered truth-telling would look like, I think an important place to start is to think about what experience of previous truth recovery processes tell us about gender and tell us about women. And so much of my own work and the book that I'm writing at the moment talks to some degree about where do we see women. But I suppose when you ask the woman question, that's the first feminist step, you ask the woman question, where are the women? When we look at the sort of spectrum of truth recovery processes, there's a really clear starting point, which is women are largely absent. They're not there. And while there's been some movement over 30 years of truth processes, and as a result of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and other measures, there's greater pressure on institutional actors to front up women. So the emphasis on the physical terms, you have to ask if there is this emphasis, then what gets excluded? And what I want to suggest is that in many of these truth-telling processes, that there are at least two elements. Today was focused on two big things that get left out. One is social and economic harms. If we take the TRC as an example, TRC largely focused on physical harms, torture, extrajudicial execution. And if we look now at the critiques of critical thinkers in South Africa and elsewhere, one thing that's interesting is the TRC fundamentally failed to engage with the economic harm of apartheid. Fundamentally failed to deal with the economic privilege that was created, and that in fact in some ways has survived the transition. Now that's, in one sense you could say that's a gender-free critique, but in some ways it's actually not, it's deeply not. Because when we exclude social and economic harms from our ambit of telling what truth of harms happened in society, we miss an enormous piece. And we miss a piece that in fact leaves women deeply vulnerable in the post-conflict phase. Particularly when we know that in most conflicts in the world, women are most likely to be refugees, they are most likely to be internally displaced persons, they are most likely to not have rights of property or other forms of ownership which makes them economically vulnerable. They're most likely to have caring responsibilities, and they're most likely to have those responsibilities in contexts where men are absent. And so if you don't piece in social and economic harm, you lose women. And sometimes that's why women don't come. If you have a choice in Rwanda to show up at Gacaca or work for a day in the field to feed your children, well, that may be one reason why we fail to see very many women showing up to Gacaca trials. So there's some connection here between presence and inclusion and what's being looked at and valued in the process of truth recovery. The second piece I want to suggest, and two of my colleagues from TJI are here today, and we have an ongoing discussion about the dangers of over-essentializing women in different ways. But one of the things I want to suggest is that in these processes of, and this focus on sexual harm, we also miss what law, both domestic law and international law, often call secondary harms. The focus on harm is to the person, the body of the person, not to the person who's connected to the person. So I think about this as a mother, but I also think about this in terms of some of the work that I've done with women, which is that harm to others, harm to your child, harm to your mother, harm to your father, harm to the neighbor with whom you are connected, is understood and internalized differently by women than it is by men. And that's, in some ways, very essentialist telling. I don't want to suggest that men don't care about these things, but I want to suggest, in a mode of feminist thinking, drawing the work of Robin West and others, that women are intimately connected in ways that men are not. And that intimate connection creates a web of connectedness and a web of connected harms. So that women may not experience harm as simply autonomously, that is to say, the harm to my body, my person, is the only harm that I feel is a harm. But the harm to my child, to my spouse, to my partner, to my mother, to my grandmother, is felt like harm. And so the question is, what do we call that harm? How do we name that harm? Do we even call it harm? Well, in many cases, law doesn't name or call those things as harm. You can say there are reasons. And black-letter lawyers, I'm sure there may be one or two of them will say, well, there's reason to do that. But if you think about truth for a minute, and draw truth away from law, and say that the functionality of these truth processes is to do something different than formal law. It's not meant to be constrained by the same rule that says this is the legal harm for which you can get a compensation in law or a criminal, you can be held criminally accountable for. In many ways, truth processes are lauded for their varying informality, for their capacity to get around these presumed roadblocks of the formalities of law that name some things as harm and some things not. What we find, or what I found in my own work, is that in fact what happens is that these informal processes replicate in many ways the exact same patriarchies and hierarchies that we see in the formal hierarchies not connected. So what I want to suggest is that it really does matter as a practical, financial, economic, legal matter, that truth gets narrowed in these processes. Because it's not just about the story we tell, and it's not, I think the story we tell is very important, but that story is also linked to a set of practical, legal, and political consequences for women and men in post-conflict societies. And for women, that space is even more complicated. I see it particularly complicated for women combatants, women who've been supported or involved in violence. Where does that story fit? Well, it really doesn't fit very easily. It fits the story of a woman, mother, victim, the story of a woman, a victim of sexual violence. There's a place for that story. There often is very little space for the more complicated stories that women might tell about where they sit, or, the sort of acceptable victimhood for women. What does that mean? And how do we start to interrogate as feminists what it means to be an acceptable female? So what I want to suggest is that there is this, what we need to be wary of, and truth can be part of this process. That in fact what looks like a moment of transformation and enablement is often a moment of really deep conflict and great paradox. And so that I hope some of those ideas will give